Awesome. Cool. Okay. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming up. Nice to see quite a decent reception tonight, especially after a bit of a crazy week for the club, as it were. A few updates. So I think it's kind of obvious. We've had the video interview I did a week or two ago with Callum on the DX Commander video channel go out. Very relieved it was well received. It was going to go one or two ways in my head. I never saw it until it got published. So slightly stressed would be a bit of an understatement, sorry. So yeah, and you'll be happy to know I have bought a new microphone as a direct result of that video. So hopefully my audio is a little bit better this evening than it was then. General things that's going on. I've had a chat with Callum and he's agreed to give us to host a Zoom presentation for us in a couple of weeks. We haven't tied him down to an exact date, but I'm hoping it'll be in 2 weeks' time, probably this same slot in 2 weeks. It's just going to be an intro into how he got into the hobby and a little bit about his background, his interests, and how he got into the cottage industry and obviously the DX Commander and that kind of thing that he's well known for. He did make one request, and that was to ask everyone who was intending to turn up to submit a non-technical question for him to answer at the end. So a bit close to the time when it's all confirmed, I'll make the appropriate arrangements on Discord so that people are able to pop in questions in advance. Other things that are going on, we have, as a club last Friday, approved that we're going to go ahead and get a bank account set up for the community. This came out as a result of the intermediate training course running and us starting to have some minimal operational costs, specifically Zoom, which is about £15 a month, and the digital cross-mode bridge, which has minimal cloud hosting costs associated with it. The idea is that we're going to ask people who attend the intermediate course, if they're able to, they don't have to, if they're comfortable to, and they appreciate the support and they value it, if they would consider donating something towards the cost of Zoom and the cost of running it. Any extra funds that come from that will go back in to the community, hopefully for things like, we've had some suggestions last time we met around having build-along events where some of the guys in the projects, homebrewing projects channels are very, very competent and very good at building and designing projects. So a few suggestions of perhaps having a little bit of money for them to design a build-along project for the club to do. Other suggestions have been about a potential field day next year. We'll potentially be looking at hiring out a campsite for a weekend, perhaps in line with a contest. So just a little bit of cash opens up windows. So we've got Callum in a couple of weeks. If anyone has any topics they're passionate about and wants to share and wants to do a presentation, you're very, very welcome. I'm currently trying to talk to one of the M7s who helps with invigilation to try and get them to do my first 3 months in amateur radio kind of, or Robin, you can do it. I may have got someone else to do it, but you can do it. See you shaking your head.
Yeah, I'm glad you've got somebody else. Thanks, mate.
That's all right. No, you can do some on electronics. It'd be right. Now, also, final thing worth mentioning is there's been a little bit of movement. Some of you might know we're doing beyond exams, which is where there's a structured way of people trying things out in the hobbies, and they get certificates if they pass or get to certain levels. And that is kind of progressing quite happily. And hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll have a support network for people who've just passed, opportunities to help them with their first QSO, plus this beyond exam things of activities and things that we can do and help people do to explore more about the hobby. Okay, so I've talked for long enough. Someone should have told me to shut up by now, but I'll do it. So without further ado, Matthew has very kindly offered to give us an introduction to DMR. Matthew has been in the club since early days. He was the one behind our cross digital bridge that we have. and has done a lot of work for it. And yeah, kindly offered to do tonight's talk. So I'm going to mute myself at this point and pass it over to you.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you, Francis. So this is a brief introduction to DMR. For some of you that are familiar with DMR, it might be a little too basic, but hopefully it covers most of the bases. I'm trying to keep it fairly short and succinct, so it's not going to cover everything. The idea is it kind of gives you the fundamentals or the building blocks to then get started, but hopefully there's enough there to get you going. So brief introduction, I'm Matthew, 2E0SIP. Became interested in amateur radio after realising how fragile modern communications were. So in 2012-ish, I was working for a voice over IP telecoms company, and there was a big fibre break somewhere in the Midlands, and it sort of brought some of the internet down, some of the communications down, mobile networks and stuff. Things were still generally kind of working, but the sort of congestion, and it was all a bit hit and miss. So kind of realised that we're totally reliant on the sort of network infrastructure, which is quite fragile. You know, there's a lot of it that can get dug up by diggers. There's a lot of it on the seabed that can get fished up by fishing boats. So yeah, there's that kind of realisation that things are actually probably more fragile than we think. So I've been licensed for 3.5 years, and I've been playing with DMR for just about as long. In that time, I've tinkered with MMDVM repeaters. MMDVM is a project that we'll touch on later. Open source DMR networks and digital bridges. So there's a lot to DMR, but I like to think I'm fairly familiar with some of it, or not the totally low level RF side, but certainly the software side. So work wise, I'm a sysadmin for a telecommunications provider, which is kind of helps with DMR, with it being sort of digital mode. I guess there is some crossover. And I grew up in the Midlands, but I now live in Watford and usually work in London. So what is digital mobile radio? So as you might have guessed, digital mobile radio is a digital radio protocol. It was conceived in 2005, and then an association was founded in 2009 to assist with interoperability between vendors. So big vendors include Motorola, Tate, and a few others. You can get DMR radios from pretty much anyone. It was initially a commercial protocol. It was adopted by radio amateurs pretty quickly, I think. It wasn't a case that this mode came out and then we've kind of picked up old, discarded retro equipment. It was kind of as soon as it was released to the commercial market, people started looking at it to use for amateur use. So it uses 4FSK modulation and time division multiple access to transmit voice and data. Again, we'll sort of dive a bit deeper into that shortly. And then audio is encoded using AMBE codec. So that's a form of compression, similar to MP3, I guess, which just means you can squeeze the voice and data into narrower bandwidth. Unfortunately, some patents do apply, and the codec is essentially closed source. There has been some reverse engineering, but it's not as good as the real thing. And then you get these things called DMR networks that can link repeaters and relay the transmission to other repeaters and hotspots. Now I realised I haven't actually got a slide for what a DMR radio looks like, so we use this one as an example. On the right, there's a popular radio. It's TYT, I believe, 380. They're quite old now, although they are still very good. Single band, but they've got lots of bells and whistles, and they're kind of cheap, so I still recommend them. So you know, it's pretty much just a standard walkie-talkie or a handheld. A lot of them will have a keypad, even the commercial ones, because the digital mode you can dial numbers and stuff, which gives them a bit more flexibility versus a traditional handheld. Yeah, so what are some benefits of DMR? So commercial use means radios are cheap and ubiquitous. the MD380 came out about 5 years ago. I think they cost about £100 new at the time, and it caused this kind of explosion in DMR. And I honestly think without that radio, it probably wouldn't have got as popular as it has. It was cheap and easy to get into, and if you speak to a lot of people who were radio amateurs around that time, pretty much everyone has got one of these radios, or certainly the sort of newer radio amateurs, shall we say. So your transmission can include metadata, so that could be who it's from and who it's to, which allows you to route calls and do stuff that's a bit fancier than just a traditional FM transmission. And then this time division multiple access, again, it allows two QSOs to take place on the same frequency. So you've effectively got one channel, a 12.5 kilohertz channel, and you can have two active voice conversations on that channel at the same time. If you imagine if you run a busy repeater, a busy radio system in something like a hospital, it's ideal if you can get more transmissions in less bandwidth. So that helps. And power consumption is lower than traditional analog radios, so you usually get longer battery life. This is an interesting one. So DMR being digital has forward error correction and redundancy in the voice. So the theory has always been that you can get a greater distance with DMR. In practice, I tend to find that's not the case. It's either the same or not quite as good. We can argue about at the end if anyone's got any other thoughts. And then these global amateur DMR networks have formed, which allow users operating one repeater to relay their transmission nationally or globally if they wish. So the next slide is probably going to be a bit controversial. There's these myths about DMR, which I think personally are myths. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. The first one is DMR is a commercial system and is unsuitable for radio amateurs. So yeah, DMR is a commercial system. I don't think that automatically makes it unsuitable for amateurs. I suspect a lot of this kind of originated when people were using commercial Motorola handhelds and the like, which they weren't very flexible. You kind of program them with a computer. Once you program them, you couldn't then change settings via the handheld itself. They were very limited. The idea being that if you give your radio to a security guard, you don't want him then to reprogram it whilst he's sat bored at 4 o'clock in the morning. So they were kind of locked down and you couldn't change anything on them. I think some of the idiosyncrasies and pain points are also down to how networks have been implemented. There's various networks, they do stuff in different ways. Sometimes the documentation is not clear because you think you're reading about one network and actually it's discussing another. And then there's been a lot of features added and requests for more features, more talk groups, more rooms, more bridges. And the nature of that, adding up all these features, unfortunately does make it more complicated. And then the next one is creating a co-plug is insanely difficult. You should just download one. So again, once you start to understand some of the basic concepts, and hopefully you'll understand those by the end of this presentation, certainly started to understand them, it becomes much easier. And then it will become clearer how the mode works and how the networks work. Personally, I feel like building a co-plug or editing a co-plug is kind of part of operating the mode. So I don't want to gatekeep and say you cannot use DMR if you haven't edited your co-plug. I certainly wouldn't say that. And I think you're welcome to use a pre-made one to sort of get started. But as you spend more time, I think it's helpful if you do start to understand the programming side a bit more. I should have explained what a co-plug is. So just for those that you don't know, the co-plug is basically the programming that you flash to the radio. So generally you use software on your computer. You create the programming, much like you'd use Chirp for a Baofeng. So you enter all your frequencies and all the details. and then upload it to the radio. So that's what the code plug is. But it's definitely time consuming, tedious, boring. It's definitely those three things, but it doesn't have to be impossible once you start to understand some of the basics. So someone started asking a question, then dropped off.
No, sorry, someone joining. I've muted them just because of background noise.
Okay. Sure. So what are the basics I need to understand? So this is quite a busy slide, but it sort of goes over the fundamentals, if you like. So the very basics are the transmit and receive frequency. I'm sure most of you will understand what those are. Similar to an analog FM repeater, it's just the frequencies that the radio is going to use. So for a repeater, they'll be different. They'll have a split. If it's a hotspot, or for simplex, they may well be the same. The next one is a color code. So this is like the CTCSS you might use on a repeater. It's primarily to avoid co-channel interference. If you imagine you've got two repeaters on the same frequency and they're 100 miles apart, so generally they're interfering with each other. But there's the odd occasion a plane might fly over and they start to interrupt. So all the color code is it just stops the two keying each other up, much like a CTCSS tone would on analog FM. The next one is the radio ID. So this is a unique number that's assigned to your radio, which most radios will then use to look up and display a call sign and a name and perhaps a location. You may well use it for radio-to-radio private calls. This part is definitely a shortcoming of DMR versus other amateur digital modes. You can't program a call sign directly into the radio. You have to use this radio ID thing, which is kind of an added complication. And then you have to have these radios that then store hundreds of thousands of contacts in their memory and then look it up, which isn't ideal, but for the most part it works. The next one that you need to have an understanding of is the slot. Again, we'll go into more detail on this shortly, but a DMR transmission has two slots, which allows these two simultaneous QSOs to happen at the same time, and you just need to understand which slot that you want your transmission on. The next is a group call. So this is a call directed to a group of radios. It could be simplex via a repeater or to a group of repeaters via the internet. And that group in a commercial setting could be something like security or hospitality. And in amateur example, you'd have a group for the UK or a group for the online amateur radio community, for example. Private calls, you don't see these much on the amateur side. It's basically a call directed to another individual radio. So if you know someone's DMR ID or their radio ID, you can effectively call just their radio. But despite the name, it's trivial for others to listen. So it's not private, as in no one else can listen in. It just means that only the person you're contacting will be able to hear it, unless someone's intentionally trying to listen to the conversation. And then the final one on this slide is the network. So different repeaters connect to different networks. They tend to be isolated and they've got different access methods and etiquettes. This is something we'll go on into a bit more detail a bit later on. But this can certainly be a point of confusion because different networks have different talk group IDs, and someone on one network won't be able to reach you on another network. So that can be a point of confusion if you're just joining DMR. Hopefully, by the end of the talk, you'll have a better understanding. Is there any questions so far? I know that's quite a heavy slide, but we'll start to break down some of these concepts a bit more in the coming slides.
We've had
Can I ask one? I know what it means because I've looked it up, but you mentioned TDMA earlier, but didn't actually explain the acronym.
Next slide, I think, Paul.
Okay.
Possibly. Okay. Oh, no, I lied. It must be the one after. Okay, so what is a radio ID? So every DMR radio and repeater has a DMR ID that can be up to 9 digits long. They help identify the radio and route causal data. In theory, you can use any DMR ID. You could make it up. But for amateurs, they're allocated by 2 organisations. One handles most of the world, and then the other handles Europe. So in the UK, we use register.ham-digital.org. And you don't need to remember that. You can look it up if you remember Ham Digital. And what generally happens is you upload a copy of your license document. That's the document that Ofcom sends you, not the certificate that you get from the RSGB. And then they issue you this 7-digit number, which is then yours forever in theory. As we discovered fairly recently, some networks will block a transmission if you have an invalid or blacklisted ID. So I would suggest, even if you don't plan on playing with DMR tomorrow, it might be worth registering for an ID just so you have one around and you don't have to worry about it when the time comes. One problem with these radio IDs is it's quite trivial to clone them. So you can easily copy someone else's radio ID. They're all publicly available. And so sometimes if someone's intentionally being a bit naughty on a repeater or whatever, they may clone your ID. Obviously the networks are aware of this, so they won't send you a letter or anything. It's just a known problem. Some commercial radio systems, such as the Motorola one, do have methods to get around this and can use encryption keys to stop people stealing radio IDs. But on the amateur side, we don't use any of the proprietary extensions. And to date, there's no open specification that prevents IDs from being cloned. Some networks do have some methods of making it more difficult. I don't know exactly how it works. I think you can lock your ID to certain repeaters, so someone can't go around using your ID on a repeater you wouldn't normally use, something like that. But it's not perfect. Here you go, Paul. So what are time slots? So TDMA is time division multiple access. It's a channel access method for shared medium networks. It allows several users to share the same frequency channel by dividing the time signal into different slots. I think I must have copied that from Wikipedia, but it is pretty accurate. It's also used in GSM, so mobile communications, and ISDN, which was an older sort of internet method of delivery. So in old money, in sort of ISDN speak, if you like, there's 2 B channels for voice and data, and then 1 D channel, which is the control channel, and that's used for synchronization and additional data. So the 2 B channels allow 2 voice or data streams to access the same channel at the same time. And in DMR, they're referred to as slot 1 and slot 2. So this diagram at the bottom shows what this kind of looks like. So you'll see these boxes labeled 1, 2, 1, 2. So in theory, you can have 2 radios transmitting at the same time to the same repeater, and they will synchronize magically, and that will prevent them from transmitting over each other. And then there's also these red slots between each voice frame, if you like. So the repeater can actually be sending your radio information as you're transmitting. So in some commercial systems, you can have a concept of priority. So if there's someone who wants to make an emergency call, the repeater can actually kick you off. It can send a message to your radio that says, please stop transmitting, that someone wants to make an emergency or a high priority call via the radio. So that's pretty cool. Again, it's not implemented on the amateur side, but it's something worth knowing about. Has anyone got any questions there? I've kind of skimmed over it, but hopefully it mostly makes sense. Okay, cool. So talk groups versus reflectors. In my opinion, this is one of the biggest points of confusion that trip people up, that confuse people, and generally cause headaches. I don't really have a personal preference. I just kind of wish that we'd gone with one and stuck with it to avoid some of this confusion. So we'll sort of go into each one now. So we'll start with a talk group. This is basically an isolated room or a conference bridge for holding a QSO, and they're usually split by topic. So like I said, you can have UK-wide online amateur radio community. You might have one for the weather and such and such. So they're generally split by topics. They're identified by a number. So for example, talk group 235 is generally the UK calling channel. And then you access these talk groups with a group call to the talk group number. On pretty much every repeater, there'll be talk group 9, which is only repeated locally, so it won't be relayed over IP to other repeaters. So if you just want a local QSO like you would on a traditional FM repeater, you generally use talk group 9. There is a caveat on that we'll come to, but at this stage, TG9 is just local. So transmission to talk group other than talk group 9 will be relayed out of the repeater via RF to local users and also into the network via IP. So what I mean is if you transmit to a talk group other than talk group 9, it will traverse the network and also get repeated out of other repeaters that are listening to that talk group. And then some talk groups are referred to as user activated or dynamic. Again, I think this can be a point of confusion, but basically they're only active once someone keys up, and they tend to time out after a period of inactivity. So they're quite useful if you've got a busy talk group like HubNet, for example, which can get incredibly busy. You don't necessarily want it transmitting on your repeater all day, every day, because it's just going to consume resources effectively. It's airtime. It will prevent other people from using other talk groups. So some are user activated, and then they'll only be active once you've keyed up, and then they tend to time out once the QSO has ended. And repeaters may carry a group of always on static talk groups, which can be useful for roaming. So for example, all the repeaters around London all carry a regional southeast talk group, and it's all static and it's always on. So the idea is, in theory, you can drive around the M25 and you can listen to QSO and it'll automatically roam and then pick up the local repeater that you've got as the best signal. Are there any questions on talk groups?
Yeah, just to add, if you do have questions as we go, or if you think of anything, feel free to drop them in the chat. I know we've got one about code plugs that I'm saving for later, but
Okay.
if anyone else gets any, feel free to drop them in, and I'll happily pass them on.
I have a question regarding inappropriate use of talk groups.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah, in my experience, UK calling 235 is anything but. I think UK calling's on 2351 generally, if you listen to the traffic on it, and it can be frustrating for the new users. I found I was very frustrated because you think, oh, I'll listen to that one, see what's happening. There's nothing happening at all. So you scan around the talk groups, and they're all doing CQ on 2351, which well, it's out of our remit. But how do we control that?
It's a good question. I do have a slide on DMR etiquette. It's not really a question I have an answer for, unfortunately. I think
That's okay, that's fine.
one of the problems with DMR, well, I say challenges, is everyone has gone crazy, and they want a talk group for cars and a talk group for bikes and a talk group for boats, and it does kind of spread the activity out, so you can find yourself spoiled for choice and kind of chasing people around. So that is, it's a blessing and a curse, if you like. We've got all this choice and all these options, but as a result, it can kind of make tracking down the action a little bit harder. But yeah, hopefully that helps. And then the next one are reflectors. So a reflector is like a conference bridge that you dial into. Again, they're identified by a number, usually 4 digits. As a sort of historical thing. You connect to a reflector with a private call to the reflector number, so it's a bit different to a talk group in that regard. The idea being, even on a commercial radio, like a Motorola or something similar, you can usually make a private call from the keypad to another radio. Obviously, they include that feature with the intention that you'd dial another radio, but some of the networks have then grabbed hold of that and use it to dial into these reflectors. So it is handy. I think that has become less advantageous as more radios come out that are kind of designed for amateur use, or certainly more flexible, because it kind of makes that a moot point, but that was why it came out originally. And then once you're connected to a reflector, all the activity will then take place on talk group 9. So again, that can be a point of confusion, because you connect to a reflector with a private call to one number, but then the actual activity, the actual QSO, takes place on the talk group 9. So the idea of these is, as I mentioned, it simplifies programming in theory for a repeater. Rather than having hundreds of channels with all the different talk groups, you can just have a couple of channels, and then you can manually dial into these reflectors. They also prevent contention problems. So one of the problems is with all these talk groups, you know, on a repeater, you might have 3 users all trying to access 3 different talk groups simultaneously, and it's not going to work because there's only the 2 available slots. So you're always going to struggle, and it won't be that clear what's going on. You might find that you can't transmit into a talk group and you don't understand why, and it's because someone else is using a different talk group. So reflectors kind of solve that by only having one active reflector at a time. That said, they're soon to be end of life on Brandmeister. So the UK was kind of unique, and it was one of the few places that used reflectors on Brandmeister. They've decided that they're fed up with supporting it. I think they want to free up some of the reflector numbers and just generally make things a bit clearer. Like I said before, I don't really have a favourite. I think they both have advantages and disadvantages, but it would be a lot simpler for people to understand if we just went with one or the other. So, in my opinion, it's a welcome change. Again, there is a caveat. Jonathan G4KLX, who is a member of the online amateur radio community, has added a feature to a piece of software called DMR Gateway, where you can effectively simulate these reflectors. So if you've got your heart set on using reflectors, it is still possible. I would only personally suggest you do that if you're really, really desperate to use reflectors, but it's personal choice, really. So that's reflectors and talk groups. Has anyone got any questions regarding those two? Because I think those 2 topics probably trip people up the most.
So this is just Francis. So just kind of getting it back into my head. So a talk group is a channel that you have a group call to talk to a group of people who are listening on that talk group. Yeah. Whereas on a reflector, the principle is that you essentially attach that group to your local channel by dialing into it.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, cool. It is a shame they're turning the reflectors off, because I do like being able to just dial up, but yeah.
Yeah, I honestly, I'm totally on the fence, because I've heard arguments for and against. Another argument against is if you're driving, you don't want to have to key up on your radio and do a private call and do all this faffing around. So yeah, there's arguments for and against, and honestly, personally, I think the arguments are pretty well balanced.
I think you hit the nail on the head on the first comment, that it's a shame they didn't pick one and stick with it.
Yeah.
Cool.
So possibly some additional confusion. So DMR networks in the UK. So in the UK there are 4 or 5, possibly more separate DMR networks. Most of them are not directly connected or are only bridged on certain talk groups. A lot of them have different etiquettes, different access methods. They use different talk group numbers for similar topics. So it can be quite confusing. So we'll start off with Phoenix, which is my local network. It's mostly the southeast, is sort of its home turf, if you like. They were formerly Motorola only, but they've since kind of softened, and they're the strong and stable network. So they've always been kind of conservative in terms of adding new features, new talk groups, and I can see the benefits to that. They've not really significantly restructured talk groups or added that many new talk groups for several years. So the benefit of that is you're not reprogramming your radio every 5 minutes. It just kind of works, and you don't have to relearn everything every few months, because it's been pretty much the same as far as I know for several years now. Downside, they don't tend to release new features. They've not got some of the fancier stuff that perhaps Brandmeister or the other networks had, but it works. So the next one is the Northern DMR cluster. It's a bit of a weird one because it's bridged to Phoenix and has the identical talk groups, and they're interconnected. So the Northern DMR cluster is basically Phoenix. It's just got a different administrator. I know one of their USPs is they use open source software. So that was one of their selling points if you're into that kind of thing. So rather than using a closed source software or bridge to do their networking, they use open source software. So as you might guess in the name, that's the north side. I think it's primarily around sort of Manchester, Leeds, that kind of area. I think it's North England rather than covering Scotland. And then next is Brandmeister. So the core group of followers in the Midlands, certainly sort of Derby, Nottingham, Leicester is kind of strong Brandmeister territory. It's mixed in the north and a handful in the south. So there's no Brandmeister repeater that serves London, for example. So reception certainly in the south can be a bit hit and miss. It's very flexible. There's lots of innovation and new features. So one of the things that I like about Brandmeister is we effectively created our own talk group. We created our own bridge. We didn't have to speak to anyone. We didn't have to get permission from anyone. We just kind of go ahead and do it. They do apply some rules to keep things sensible. But as a general rule, I'll let you do what you want as long as you're sensible. And then they've got cool features, like they've got these really comprehensive dashboards. You can query who's transmitted when, you can search for popular talk groups, and see all the activity there. So Brandmeister sort of technology wise probably come out top in comparison to the other networks, which have a few less frills. So the next one is I'm not even sure, I think it's Salop, I'm not sure, I don't know if there's someone from Shropshire that can set me straight, but it's Salop repeater group. They have a bunch of repeaters around Shropshire, but they migrated to Brandmeister, so they still kind of keep this entity going, but they've effectively moved to Brandmeister. I think if you've got this little tiny isolated network, you're kind of limiting the amount of traffic that you're going to get. So it does make sense to then bridge into a global network and get a bit more traffic. And then similarly, there's also the DMR Southwest cluster, which is kind of around Bristol and Somerset. there's no links to other networks. There's like no functionality, but it's super simple. So on slot 1, they just have talk group 9 for like local repeater use, and then on slot 2 they have, I think it's talk group 850 or something, and that just comes out of all the repeaters, and that's it. There's 2 talk groups, so it's super simple. You don't have to faff around programming your radio. It just works, and honestly, I can see some merit to that. There's always this argument that DMR is kind of complicated and have to spend too much time programming your code plug. Well, if you have it that simple, that kind of removes that element to it. I've only ever used Phoenix and Brandmeister. I've not used any of the others because I've not been in the sort of coverage region. But has anyone got any questions or anything they want to add, or maybe I forgot a network?
No, it's actually good timing. A question from Paul. He's been trying to ask, but yeah, he isn't muted, but having microphone issues. So yeah, a question from Paul W. He said Southwest cluster is on its own, 9 Southwest repeaters plus an echo link. So would my only option to go on, he's phrased it as, would my only option to go on DMR be a hotspot? I'm assuming he means one of the other networks.
Yeah, I think so. So as far as I can tell, I don't think the Southwest clusters support hotspots at all. I suspect that they're using the native networking functionality that comes with the Motorola repeaters, so it's super basic. You don't get any of the bells, whistles, and hotspots and all this good stuff. So yeah, unfortunately, the only option would be to get a hotspot, really. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that makes sense. You see, I'm one of those. I've not tried any of those networks. I've played with Phoenix and Brandmeister. I love myself. I was just having a look. Yeah, no, Peter just quickly said his local repeater GB3 Papa Bravo is a Motorola, so it sounds like that lines up exactly with what you're saying. But yeah, I've been on Phoenix, and I think you got it right with Phoenix UK. It works, but it's kind of so restrictive when you see what Brandmeister can do. And it's kind of a nice thing because in a way, by being so strict, you can kind of say, this is how it is, and you can simplify it for people. But then when they realize what they can do, it becomes a restraint rather than a benefit. It's an interesting one. Yeah, I'll shut up in case there's any other questions, but I can't spot anything on chat at this point. Anyone else? Cool.
Okay, cool. So I wasn't sure whether to include this slide or not. It's one of those where I'm not sure whether it's going to cause more confusion or if it'll clear some up. So in DMR, there's a concept of tiers. So there's 3 tiers. First one being tier 1. It's simplex only, and it's usually mobile to mobile. So there's no slots, and it's aimed at PMR 446 type usage. It shouldn't be used on repeaters. So you can get cheapish digital radios now, sort of license-free, low power, short range things. You do have to be careful not to use them on repeaters. There was one particular Baofeng DMR radio that was released. It was only tier 1. And it interfered with repeaters. It would work, but it would just stomp all over both time slots and kind of upset people using a repeater. So that's one thing you have to watch out for. As far as I know, it was just one bad thing that you've got to watch out for. So just watch out for those. If you're paying sort of 40, 50 quid for a Baofeng that does DMR, just double check that it's not one of these ones that were only tier 1. So there's tier 2, which is what amateurs use. It supports dual slot operation and repeater usage. And then there's tier 3, which is an advanced trunk system. It supports multiple repeaters for roaming and can switch between repeaters if they're already in use. So generally on those kind of systems, you'll have like a control or data channel, which is telling radios which repeater, which slot is free, and then the radios will switch between them. So as an end user, you'd be basically unaware as far as you know. You're just transmitting to the security talk group, and then the radio and this control system will then go, yeah, okay, you need to move to this repeater and use this slot. So they're generally for advanced commercial usage. I'm not aware of any amateurs using tier 3 stuff. In a way, we do try and sort of replicate it with the way that the DMR networks are built and constructed. But we're not using any tier 3 features. I suspect they're probably a lot of the more advanced features in DMR tends to be proprietary. So it will just be a specific multi-roller thing. And you would probably have to buy a license for the repeater and buy a license for the handset as well. So you can get quite expensive. So amateurs generally have just avoided the more sort of advanced bits and pieces, but then replicated it in software effectively.
Apparently, there's a side comment. Someone said that tier 3 is a replacement to Airwave for emergency services.
Yeah, they're very similar. So sort of, I don't know if I'd say replacement, definitely competitor. But yeah, you have these systems, Airwave, Tetra, DMR tier 3, which do similar things. They're almost like a crossover between part mobile network and part sort of traditional radio repeaters.
Got a comment from Paul that it was the Bearfang DM5R that's the one to avoid. Okay, apparently, cool. There we go.
Yeah.
Oh, and sorry, I've spotted there is a 5R plus that would have tier 2, just to confuse things.
Yeah, that's the problem. You would have thought they would learn from the mistake. They released this Duff radio. You think that the next one they released would have had a significantly different name. Just kind of shuffled some of the letters around.
Yeah, there is another comment from Paul. Can M7s use hotspots?
Yeah, there's no. If you're licensed, you can use a hotspot. Generally, they're quite low power. They're 10 milliwatts, and you can put restrictions on them. So you can restrict your hotspot to only accept a transmission from your radio ID, which prevents other people from using it, and that kind of satisfies the requirement that you can't relay third-party traffic. So I'm glad you covered that question, asked that question, because it is actually worth discussing. So yeah, anyone can use a hotspot. You just have to make sure that other people cannot use it, and what people generally do is limit it down to their DMR ID. It's called, I think it's called private mode, effectively. So that kind of satisfies that requirement. If you want a public hotspot, you can apply, an intermediate can apply for an NOV to run a kind of high-powered hotspot. It will still probably only be 1 watt. But yeah, you can apply for one of those as an intermediate, which is actually quite nice. NOVs are generally quite restrictive. What about code plugs? So you can't really talk about DMR without talking about code plug. So first of all, code plug is the programming file containing the channels that's then flashed or uploaded to the radio. Don't be put off. It's tedious and time consuming, but once it's clicked, it's not hard. I mean, I wouldn't say I love doing it because it can take so long. But yeah, don't be put off. There's a lot of people that it just totally puts them off, and you just got to kind of stick with it. Ask questions. We've got the digital voice channel on the Discord. You pop up, someone will always answer your question. I don't own every radio, but I own several of them, and most of the concepts are the same between them. So if you're stuck, someone will probably be able to help out. You can get pre-made code plugs, so you get a pre-made one, get to grips with it, and then start editing it. So you might find a lot of these talk groups will have every repeater in the UK, which it can be tedious if you're scrolling through this huge list and you just want your local repeaters, and perhaps you've got a holiday home in Wales. So you can just slim the list down to the ones that actually are relevant to you, and then perhaps rename them and start tweaking things. So that's a good way of getting to grips with them. So depending on your radio, you can get them online, or you might find that if there's a friend or someone on Discord can send you one. So really, to go sort of deep dive into do a presentation of its own, or sort of almost like a Twitch stream of someone playing with a code plug. But the basics, there's kind of 3 basics, and these are sort of very basics. But the first thing you need to know is the contact. So this is the ID of the talk group, reflector, or user that you wish to contact. The next one is the channel, which is the RX and TX frequencies, so receive and transmit frequencies, the slot and the contact. And then finally is this concept of zones. So it's an arbitrary group of channels. Some radio is limited to 16, and then you basically just group some of your channels into these zones. So commonly you would split them into a repeater or a region. So you might have the GB7 HR group zone, and then puts all your various talk groups in there. So they're kind of the very basic things. There are lots of other check boxes and stuff that you kind of got to work your way around, but hopefully myself, or ideally someone else, will run a session on that in the future. So I think it's probably worth going through. Are there any questions on code plugs? I know that really skims through it, but I want to try and keep this kind of short, as short as possible without going too deep.
Just to comment on code plugs really is that it's, if you do want to look for one, it's worth, if you bought the, for example, if you've got the Anytone, which a lot of people have, or one of the TYTs, a lot of Moonrakers seem to produce and maintain a lot of code plugs on the website. So that's an obviously, and if you need to download one, it's worthwhile, although they are very heavy because they have every repeater and every configuration in the whole country in. So they can be a bit overwhelming, but it's just a mention.
Yeah, I know I've got an Anytone, and I've looked at the Moonraker code plug, and it's very comprehensive. Everything's there, but even just scrolling through the zones, the groups of channels, it can take you sort of half an hour to find the repeater you want.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely beneficial to kind of clean it up and tailor it to what you need.
Even if it is just pulling the repeaters you want to the top and the channels to the top, it gives you something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Go on, Robin. Sorry.
Robin speaking. It's well, I downloaded the Moonraker one, and yes, I was overwhelmed. But once I got my head around it, all I did was put the bits I wanted into my own zones. It's exactly the same as it was. I've just added more zones, and it works.
Yeah, it's a good way of doing it. Yeah, and then it kind of gives you the sort of experience and perhaps a bit more confidence in editing yourself. It's definitely a good way to go about it. So the next one is hotspots, and we're kind of getting towards the end. I'm pretty sure I kind of ran a lot longer than I anticipated, but there's a lot to go over, unfortunately. So hotspots are a low-powered gateway allowing you to access DMR networks without requiring the use of a repeater. So someone mentioned that they are in the southwest cluster coverage region. So if you're in a region that doesn't have a Brandmeister repeater or doesn't have a Phoenix repeater, they're a good way of getting into a different network. They're good if you don't have access to a repeater, or perhaps you're in a flat and you can't get an antenna on the roof. So there's a number of different reasons why you want to use a hotspot. They're usually simplex, so you don't get a concept of slots. That's basically just cost saving, really. You can get more expensive duplex ones with slots, a bit fancier, but generally they're simplex. So there's 2 main types. There's MMDVM based and Shark RF open spots. MMDVM stands for multi-mode digital voice modem, as far as I remember, and that's open source. It can move quite quickly. Like I said, Jonathan G4KLX is an active member of the online radio community. His development tends to be in sort of spurts, so when he gets time, he'll kind of really focus on it for a few weeks or a few months, and there'll be loads of new features, and then it'll go quiet for a few months, and then there'll be this big burst again. The one thing I'd say is they do require a bit of tinkering. So there's Raspberry Pis and SD cards. Then perhaps not for everyone. It depends really what you're, if you want to be tinkering around with something, or if you want something that just works. So the alternative is these Shark RF open spots. They're pretty expensive. I think the current one is the Open Spot 3. And they're about 250 quid. It's a standalone unit. There's no SD cards. They've got a built-in battery, got built-in Wi-Fi. So it's a lot of money, but the theory is they just work. Functionality-wise, it's very similar between them. They both get you access to DMR networks, essentially. So that's kind of a personal choice. I'm more of a tinkerer or a hacker, if you like. So I like their MDVM stuff. It's fun to play with Raspberry Pis and all these bits and pieces. But I appreciate some people don't want to spend that time or effort in maintaining these things. In which case, if you can get over the cost, then perhaps Open Spot's a better choice. And then Pi-Star is an operating system designed for MMDVM-based repeaters and hotspots. It simplifies configuration. If you're going to go the hotspot route, you probably best start looking into Pi-Star. You basically copy it to an SD card, you stick it into a Raspberry Pi. It's got a web interface that will show you, who's currently transmitting. It'll show you the logs. You can tweak, can configure everything, and get it all set up. So it's definitely a good place to start. The only thing I'd say with the hotspots is go slow if you're a beginner. So certainly with MMDVM and Pi-Star, they have all these features, like you can connect to 2 networks at the same time. So you can connect to Brandmeister, and you can connect to Phoenix, and then you can connect to Yaesu Fusion, which is another different digital protocol from Yaesu, as you might guess from the name. So it's got all these features, and my advice there really is don't run before you can walk. You might kind of get overwhelmed by it. So start off, connect to one network, kind of get to grips with it, and you can start experimenting with some of these more advanced stuff. I mean, obviously, if you want to jump in at the deep end, then go ahead. But if some people might find it easier if they kind of take things step by step. We did touch on this briefly. So there is some etiquette involved, so avoiding the ban police. So some talk groups are allocated as calling channels. These are generally for announcing that you wish to have QSO. Generally in DMR, you don't call CQ. Instead, you say your call sign, listening for any calls on talk group, and then you repeat the talk group ID. So it'll be something like, this is 2E0SIP, listening for any calls on talk group 235. The reason that you generally recommended to actually say the talk group you're on, either the ID or the name, is just if someone's not looking at their radio, they might be scanning, or they might have multiple radios. So if you just identify which talk group you're on, it makes it a lot easier for someone to come back to you and then find it. Once you've made contact on the calling channel, you can have a quick chat. So you can introduce yourselves, exchange names, locations, call signs. But when you want to start rag chewing, it's generally suggested that you QSY to another talk group. So both Brandmeister and Phoenix have this concept of chat talk groups, and that's probably where you should go once you've established contact. And then the final thing is just leave a gap between overs. With bridges and all this interconnection stuff, you can have problems with people doubling over each other. If someone's super quick on their PTT, because of latency and stuff in the network, you can end up with problems. So the general suggestion is leave a gap between overs of a few seconds, and every few minutes you should leave a longer gap. So that lets people break in or helps people disconnect their hotspots and stuff. So yeah, just leave a gap, and that's probably one thing that I'd stress the most, because it's so easy to forget. If you find yourself on a busy talk group like UK HubNet, there's just no gaps. Rapid fire, you can't break in, and it can be frustrating. And that is the end of the slides. If anyone's got any questions or anything that I've missed, just give me a shout. And Francis, if you want to read out whichever questions you've got.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just pause in case anyone wants to say anything themselves, but I do have a few. Quite a few, actually. Okay, so to kick it off, regarding code plugs, there's just a question. Do you know of any spreadsheets or anything that people can use to kind of automate building them, or are you aware of anything like that?
There are some tools which I would have to Google. There's one called Code Plug Editor, and there's a few others. But yeah, there are people who've made tools that can help pragmatically generate code plugs. And actually, the Anytone does natively support importing CSVs, which can speed things up. So yeah, there are tools that you can use that can make things a little bit easier.
Cool. One from Paul about foundation license limits. Can you build your own hotspot as a foundation user?
That's a good question. I'm pretty sure I did. Perhaps don't tell anyone about that. I honestly don't know. I built hotspot with, so you generally buy the RF module. So I suspect that would probably be okay, because it's like a pre-made thing. I don't know if many people designing hotspots from scratch. You probably, you couldn't design a hotspot from scratch as a foundation license holder. Could you create one with one of these pre-made RF modules? I personally think that would probably be okay.
Yeah, it's been asked of the RSGB a few times, and the consensus has been yes. You can use so when you get them in from China, they tend to come. I don't have mine to hand. They tend to come with just one part that needs soldering on, or you need to attach an antenna on, or something like that. But generally, yeah, you're absolutely fine, and you can definitely use one within your limits. That was just actually something I was going to mention. There are generally two frequencies for hotspots that you should use, either 434 megahertz or 438.8 megahertz. If you look at the band plan for 70 centimeters, it does highlight those two as being reserved for low power personal hotspot devices. So that's just something worth being aware of. Got a question from John M7YTH. Regarding talk groups. Question is, are talk group numbers hierarchical? So does 260 relate to 2601 and 2601X and so on, and talk group 9 and 9990? Is there any order to it?
The answer to that question is it's complicated. So certainly Brandmeister uses this concept of MSID, I think, which is mobile subscriber ID. So someone of these regulatory bodies has kind of issued a prefix to every country to use for mobile phones. So in the case of the UK, it's 234 and 235. So you might notice that a lot of the talk groups in the UK begin 234 or 235, as do a lot of all of the issued radio IDs. So there is some kind of logic to it there. In terms of them being sequential, sometimes I think 235 is calling, and then 2351, 2352, 2353 a chat. But there's no hard and fast rule other than these prefixes. On Phoenix, you get these 3-digit talk groups that begin with 8. They're generally regional, so there'll be one for northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast. So on some networks, some talk groups kind of have a relationship, but I wouldn't say it was the norm for everything. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, it's very much a yes, kind of, sort of.
Yeah.
There we go. So yeah, I think you covered it in passing earlier on, but it's worth just revisiting a question from James. He unfortunately missed the start. 2E1GLQ is just asking, can you call users directly on DMR like you can on D-Star?
Yeah, you can. Or you can. Again, it's one of these kind of maybe sometimes. So you can do it. I believe Phoenix don't support it. Brandmeister, they do support it. The network supports it. Some repeater keepers say that they don't like it. So it's complicated. It's definitely not the done thing. I don't think I've ever received a sort of out of the blue direct call. On Phoenix, I'd probably say you're welcome to experiment with it. Sean Brandmeister, yeah, feel free to experiment with it, but it's definitely not the norm.
I've done it on Brandmeister. Send a call, and the alerts the far end, and they can answer you back or refuse to answer you back. My problem's SMS, but that's another story. But yes, you can. I have done direct calls. In fact, I've done them online across the Atlantic on a Zoom with another group. So yes, it can be done. But as a QSO, I think it's a bit cheeky. If your friends do it, if you're two friends doing it, I think that's all right. Or if you're expecting it, I think that's all right.
I was thinking if you spoke to someone on a talk group, then rather than QSY to another talk group, could you call that person directly?
Yes, if they're not on a repeater that doesn't allow it.
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely supported, but it's not the norm. Most people would QSY to a chat talk group because the private call isn't encrypted. Anyone can still listen, and amateur radio has always been, sort of public or whatever. You can't use encryption, you can't use this and that. There's this expectation that people will be listening. So yes, it's not the norm. You're welcome to try it, but it's not. I wouldn't say it happens very often.
It can. I mean, I've seen it plenty on hotspots, but when you come to repeaters, you've got to remember there's only 2 time slots, and they're shared for everyone. And if you're doing a direct message to a radio ID, you're no longer transmitting to a generic talk group, and unless everyone happens to have the radio in promiscuous mode and they can hear every transmission coming out the repeater, chances are you're just taking up a slot and no one knows it or knows why. Whereas if you go on to one of the talk groups, they have like call off channels. I think it's 81, 82, 83 or something. If you move QSY from the calling channels to one of the private rooms, then at least people are aware that you're there and you're talking. So yeah, what Matt said, it's just a bit, it's almost verging on rude.
Okay.
On a repeater anyway, on DMR, on a hotspot, go nuts. Let's have a look. Paul, slightly off topic, need a portable. So any suggestions on, so when you say portable, Paul, you've just got a comment from Paul about suggestions for radios. Needs a portable one. Do you mean more like a mobile unit rather than a handheld? Or I need to have close to, oh, hang on. Any advice on DMR portables, as I need to have as close to the 10 watt limit whilst I'm out and about, and I don't have a car, so I need it handheld. So high powered DMR radios that are handheld.
So I think that the Anytone 868 and 878 has turbo mode. I think on paper it goes up to 7 watts. I think in reality it doesn't. And you'll tend to find that with most radios. Some of them, like you can get a Baofeng, which is 9 watts. But what they've done is they've taken the 5 watts on high power, 3 watts on medium power, and 1 watt on low power, and then added them all together. So, oh yeah, it's 9 watts, but you're only ever going to get 5 watts out of it. So, yeah, a lot of the radios can kind of claim more power than perhaps reality. The only thing I'd say, I guess it's more generic, is it really down to height in your antenna rather than there's not a significant difference between 5 watts and 10 watts. I can go sort of, 40 miles across London on 1 watt with the right antenna and in the right direction. So yeah, I think you're probably best off just sticking with a 5 watt or a 7 watt handheld.
I think Paul's got a comment. I think you may have carried it off.
Let me unmute. There we go.
There we go.
Yeah, something I came across recently, which would actually help in Paul's situation. There are now MMDVM portable hotspots that come in sort of like a card pack sized unit, and it's all in one. You just need to tether it to, say, a phone, and then you put your radio on low power, and you can work anywhere. I can post links on the forum on Discord if needed.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, I think Matt hit it on the head. And at the end of the day, there is only so much power you want radiating out of an antenna that's right next to your head. So they won't go that high. It's just a pain. One more question for you. Currently my last one, but people feel free to keep sending me them. What are the advantages of DMR over, say, YSF or D-Star? That's a question from Carl.
Ooh, controversial. Probably just price is the main one. You can pick up a reasonable dual band DMR radio for less than 100 quid. I think YSF, the cheapest one, as far as I can tell, is about 180 if you pay sort of face value for it brand new. And D-Star is usually silly money. You're usually looking at sort of, it's usually on like £500 handhelds, which is just nuts in my opinion. I think YSF is probably easiest to use. D-Star is the oldest, and I don't think it's particularly easy to use. There's a lot of, it's like DMR, there's so many different configuration options you need to enter. That you've got your call, repeat 1, repeat 2. There's all these acronyms. So I think if anything, it's almost as complicated as DMR. So it's horses for courses, really. And I guess, you've got people who don't like Yaesu, they only have Icon. So you might have a brand preference there. But one thing I'd say is probably don't necessarily rush out and buy a DMR ID. For the simple reason is there's a lot of people who've got them out there probably gathering dust. So I've got like 3 or 4, and I'd probably be happy to lend someone some if they were local for a couple of weeks. So if you're a member of a local club or something, it might be worth asking around before you go and drop some cash on a radio.
Matthew, I'm not suggesting right now, unless you've got it ready, but could it be worth sorting out a session on code plugs and the basics for them?
Yeah, we probably should do that at some point. I don't know what the schedule is looking like, but yeah, it's something we should definitely go over. I don't know if that's something best done as I don't know how best that's delivered, if it's delivered as a presentation or more of a workshop. I don't know.
It's interesting trying to get the balance in this world.
I'm happy to show mine, but I wouldn't say mine is the best, and I've only got one radio to show off with it as well. So
I'd probably do it on the Enetone. That seems to be the common one. Cool.
One thing I'd just say, I appreciate I've kind of ran on, so I guess if anyone needs to drop off, don't feel like they need to hang about. I'm happy to kind of keep asking questions for a while. But yeah, certainly if people need to get off, then feel free. Thanks for joining.
Cool. So, yeah, suggestion has been a workshop for it, and it may be as simple as having a Zoom day where a few of us who are confident with it just have Zoom open between us for the day, and people can stop in. Maybe we have like a little program around it. It's a question from Nicola. Any plans to do C4FM or D-Star overview?
Your thought? I would hopefully someone does. I'm not super familiar with those modes, but it won't be for me. But hopefully someone will be able to throw something together.
I could certainly throw C4FM or YSF, but I'm keen it not to be me every day. People will get sick of seeing my face.
And with D-Star, it's been around long enough. I know I'm sort of probably going to be shot down for saying go elsewhere, but there's probably enough videos on YouTube that probably do a better introduction. I'm used to D-Star, and I could probably say YouTube would explain it better.
I'd say we get, as a minimum, we've got the wiki, the links on oarc.uk. And what we can do is we'll make sure that this video is pointed to in that as an intro to DMR. And I'll probably do an intro to YSF or Fusion, unless I can find someone else. And we can point at some useful resources for D-Star as well. And that'll be a nice little
I can have a look at D-Star, because obviously I know about it. I can see if the videos are okay. And I'll at least chuck them in digital, if not the resources, the useful links.
Cool. Okay, so as far as the recording goes, I'm going to just wind it up now. Just to press stop, just so that we can all talk freely now. The rest of the guys have gone.